Hi everyone, this is William with this week's episode of Life on the Magic Mountain, and I try every week to post these on Friday, but it's now Sunday, and so I'm a couple days late, and I'm actually a week late with another one of my series, the Romanov Dynasty of Russia, so I have some catching up to do, but this is today an interesting chapter. We're about 18% through the book. Actually, I should say almost precisely 18% because my Kindle keeps track of that. And so if you've been watching all along these videos, I congratulate you and assure you that you can now speak convincingly about the themes in the Magic Mountain at any cocktail party that you might end up at. So for me, that's an important thing. I don't know about you, but one must sound impressive at cocktail parties. Okay, so the title of this week's chapter is Analysis, and it's it centers on a lecture given by the assistant doctor, the house arts, Krokowski, and he likes to psychoanalyze people, and so that's a reference. That's what it refers to. And the title of the lecture he's giving is Love as a Force Conducive to Illness. And it's pretty much a mandatory lecture. I mean, nobody is going to be standing there keeping track, and then, the people that don't show up will be in trouble. But it's expected, and it's very bad form not to be there, so much so that Joachim, who is not the kind of person who would typically enjoy this sort of thing, always shows up very punctually and is a little upset when Hans Castor comes in from his long walk just at the very last minute as the lecture is starting. Okay, so this is another chapter that really emphasizes the difference between the way things are organized and the way people behave at the Berghof, at the tuberculosis sanatorium, as opposed to everything that Hans Castorp has experienced in his previous life as a young man from a wealthy bourgeois family in Hamburg. So he starts out by noting he's sitting in a chair behind Frau Chauchat and looking around at the other ladies as well. He notices that the women at the Berghof slouch. So, and he says that they are not like the women, or the narrator says they are not like the women in Hans Castorp's social circle at home, who sat straight-backed at the table and turned only their heads to speak with pursed lips to gentlemen on either side. So they sit very upright, and if they want to talk to someone, they only turn their heads. They don't sort of move their upper body. It's very disciplined. And so that is one of the surface ways that Hans Castorp can see that he's entered into terra incognita, and he believes that these women are allowing themselves to slouch, not because they're from the lower classes, they certainly aren't, but because some of them are from the East, the land of timelessness and license in Hans Castorp's mind. I'm not saying that myself. And also, in the cases where they're not from the East, they are ill, and their illness gives them the same sense of timelessness and license. Okay, and then we turn our focus to the lecturer, Dr. Krokowski. So if you recall, he has an unusual way of dressing that very much ties him to the underworld aspect of the sanatorium. He wears sandals. Reading this, I kind of, in a modern frame, a North American sort of frame of mind, you would think of this as a guy who wears Birkenstocks, right, with thick socks. And he doesn't wear the typical shirt and tie. He wears a shirt with a soft collar maybe kind of a Slavic sort of shirt. He is Polish. And instead of wearing the white doctor's smock, he actually wears a black doctor's smock. And so the overall impression is that he's sort of like a monastic, sort of like a monk, but it's definitely an underworld figure that we have here. And he also has this hypnotic effect on the people in the audience, all the patients in the audience. The narrator tells us that he holds them in a state of profound, spellbound attention. And indeed, as we go further in the chapter, we see that after the lecture, the audience all sort of get up en masse and follow him when he leaves the room. And the quote is, "It was as if they were thronging after him, hesitant, without a will of their own, and yet in dazed unanimity like a swarm of rats behind the Pied Piper." So both Krokowski and the head doctor, Dr. Behrens, Hofrat Behrens, are in this, they're sort of like underworld wizards, There's something, again, you have the title, is there any irony when Hans Castorp chose the title Zauberberg? They're kind of like these wizards who preside over this magical underworld realm, even though, there's also the irony of the fact that they're on a mountainside, but it's also very definitely the underworld, and it was Herzen and Brini who pointed that out to Hans Castorp. Okay, so returning to the lecture itself, love is a force conducive to illness. So this is one of the philosophical interludes in this very long 800-plus page book that sometimes throw people for a loop a little bit. And they ask themselves, am I interested in this? Do I want to read a book of philosophy? And, it might seem kind of obscure, but definitely if you find yourself in that, with that frame of mind, carry on. It's, you're going to, if you let yourself sort of be taken in its grip, and let, in this chapter, Krokowski be a Pied Piper for you as well, if you immerse yourself in it. Or if you let Thomas Mann be the Pied Piper throughout the whole novel, then, go with the flow. It's good. It's great stuff. And what he's talking about is the force of love. And he's got to link the force of love to the idea of illness. So Hans Castorp, again, is rattled. And this time, it's not the women around him slouching, it's the very subject itself. In quotes, we have, "How did one go about discussing such a delicate subject, something of such a private nature, here in broad daylight, before an audience of both ladies and gentlemen?" So we have the same issue in English as you have in German, in the German original, with love. How do you translate love? Are we talking about erotic love? Are we talking about selfless, altruistic love? Are we talking about the love between family members? And Hans Castorp is, I'm not sure how comfortable he is with any of those. We think immediately of it being erotic love, and it certainly is in this lecture. But it turns out that Hans Castorp has problems with the very word, with the word love itself. And, so here, as things have been introduced to us, we have two more or less taboo topics in the sanatorium. One is love and one is death. And even though it's taboo among the patients to talk about those things in any kind of depth, they're still always present beneath the surface. And you can talk about them in a surface level, but if you go too far, as Castorp does one evening at the table in talking about death, and his fellow patients are very unappreciative of that. If you go too far, then then you're triggering that taboo and people are not going to like it. So you can laugh about, oh, who's having an affair with who, but you don't talk deeply about the subject of love, whether it's erotic love or any other kind of love. So in relation to the word itself, we're told of Kastorp, it seemed to him as if he had never spoken it himself before or heard it pass anyone else's lips. So, wow, I maybe I shouldn't be surprised about that, because I don't think it was a word that people, at least in England and Germany, I don't know about France, and in sort of Anglo-Saxon America, it doesn't seem to have been a word that you could use it in a very sentimental form or in poetry. But I'm not sure that people typically said to each other, oh, I love you, as they do now. If you're in the U.S. now, then people say it constantly. Even when I went to one afternoon to make egg rolls for my sister-in-law's catering business, and there was a person there I hadn't met before, and she said something like, hi, my name is Patty, I love you, and it's like, oh, okay, she literally says that to everyone, I guess, just to be positive, but I was a bit like Hans Castorp in that respect. That did take me aback, but we have Hans Castorp, our fictional patient, and we have Grand Duke Dmitri, our real patient, who was at Sanatorium Schatzalp. And, maybe it was more or less a cultural difference, because I've noticed in reading Dimitri's diaries and they are diaries, they are private, but he uses the word love a lot. I can't imagine Hans Castorp using that word that freely. He talks about, I love so-and-so, or if he's angry as a teenager, I don't love my aunt anymore, I don't love this person anymore. And, consistently as an adult, he also uses that word. And sometimes in the way that we in English would use the word like, but sometimes, in the deeper sense of love. Although when one of his cousins at one point, when they were seeing each other after this long absence and having this reunion after the revolution, and his cousin was sort of pouring out his love and using the word love for Dmitri, I really do love you, you're my cousin. And Dmitri didn't like that. He said, I believe in showing people that you love them rather than telling them. But I think maybe he was just annoyed on this particular occasion, because like his cousin Andre, he did tend to use the word a lot, apparently more than Hans Castorp would have considered appropriate. So there would have been other people at the very international Berghof, as at the very international real Sanatorium Schatzalp, who would have had different just cultural differences that included things like that could be problematic, I guess. Okay, so Krokowski, in the course of his lecture, is going to give the bourgeois its due. So he's going to talk about how bourgeois restrictions can be very important when one experiences this sort of wild, natural instinct of love. And we're told by Castorp that he discussed love's frightening forms, bizarre, agonized, eerie mutations of its symptoms and omnipotence. Of all our natural instincts, he said, it was the most unstable and exposed, fundamentally prone to confusion and perversion. And I think most of us would probably, maybe we wouldn't use the word perversion, but I think most of us would probably agree with that. I mean, there's a reason why all the great poetry and songs and novels are written on this subject of love, and it's because we can't quite figure out what's happening to us when we're in love and what love is and so on and so forth. But this is when he brings in the bourgeois element and says that bourgeois restrictions are the counteracting and corrective elements that are needed to keep things from getting out of control, or from things getting out of balance between healthy and unhealthy forms of love. But then, is he really in favor of these bourgeois restrictions? Well, apparently he says that the two clusters of forces, I'm quoting now, both those of the love instinct and the impulses hostile to it, among which shame and disgust, or to be noted in particular, exhibited tensions and passions that exceeded all normal bourgeois bounds. Okay, so yeah, a battle would ensue from these opposing forces, the sort of bourgeois restrictions on the one hand and the just irrepressible passion. I shouldn't say irrepressible, but just this great tidal wave of passion on the other hand. So according to Krokowski, in most cases, repression wins out. So quoting fear, conventionality, aversion born of modesty, all these repressed love held it chained in darkness. But, that's the end of the quote, but it turns out to be a Pyrrhic victory because love, quoting again, continued to live on in the dark, secret depths, straining for fulfillment, and broke the bonds of chastity and reappeared, though in transmuted, unrecognizable form. Okay, so what is the transmuted, unrecognizable form? Well, what else? We know from the title of the lecture, Love is a Force Conducive to Illness, that the transmuted form of passion is illness. So if your passion, erotic passion, love passion is repressed by these counteracting and corrective bourgeois elements, then you end up sick. It comes back in the form of illness. And I don't know how much that idea is current nowadays. It certainly has been current in the past with tuberculosis and with other illnesses. And in fact, I've referred before to the book, fairly famous work by the American essayist Susan Sontag called Illness as Metaphor. And Susan Sontag had cancer. And she talked about how she was constantly encountering, this was back in the 60s, I believe, early 60s, I think. And at that time, she was sort of everywhere confronted with people's preconception that she was a repressed person and that is what had caused her cancer. And I don't know that they said, repressed specifically in with respect to love and with eros and passion, but they considered at that time cancer to be something that had to do with repression. And every once in a while you will hear these things. I had a doctor once who was kind of joking, but he said, mean, nasty people die of heart attacks, and good people, kind people die of cancer. And, that could be very hurtful, right? If you died of a heart attack and you were a really nice, kind, generous person, but people were equating heart disease with, these sort of fiery type A personalities. But anyway, it's apparently something that Dr. Krokowski believed in. And we kind of see it so spoiler alert, the two cousins, one of whom, the very bourgeois Castorp in the environment of the sanatorium is able to let go of that repression and throw himself into a love affair, and he does not develop an illness and die. He ends up leaving the sanatorium. Joachim, on the other hand, who also has a passion for a woman at the sanatorium, for a young Russian woman, he holds that impulse under very strict control and won't even talk to this woman, except, when it's socially necessary. If they are saying hello as they sit down all together at the same table at dinner, then he says hello or he nods to her, but he won't let himself talk to her or form any kind of tie, and he dies. So there's sort of this undercurrent of agreement in the novel with Dr. Krokowski's sort of causal link between unexpressed passion and illness and hence death. Okay, so after the lecture is over and Hans Castorp is thinking a little bit, we have the word magic come into play, and he's thinking of it being magical, this idea that women all over the world, across cultures, as he sees it, dress in a way to be attractive. And he says there's something magical about that, and it's almost like a magical force of nature that's giving women this desire, and giving society and society giving them the license to do this, to dress not in a modest way, but in an attractive way. And that makes him ask the question of, what if sickness makes women unfit for motherhood? Should they still be allowed to dress in an attractive, alluring way? And he thinks, well, no, not really, because what is the point then? What is the point? There's no more point to a sick woman dressing in an alluring way than there was a point in me as a boy falling in love with another boy. So he links that also to the passion that he had for this boy at school, Pribislav, and that being a pointless passion because it could not produce ultimately homosexual love or love with a woman who is in the grips of quite possibly terminal illness. Those are dead ends, genetically speaking, in his mind. So he's sort of mixing these two elements of what you had during that day and age, not just, all over the Western world, including even more strongly in the U.S., this idea of eugenics, and sick people or people prone to certain sicknesses should not reproduce. That should not be allowed. And that kind of pseudoscience, what people saw back then as science, and mixing it up with this idea of the magical and the mystical. And our very bourgeois Hans Castorp finds out through his stay at the sanatorium that his natural inclination is actually more on the side of the magical and the mystical than it is on the side of science and bourgeois sensibilities and propriety and pseudoscience. Okay, so it is an interesting question about what people's attitude was back then towards tuberculosis and marriage and procreation, and it's sort of varied. Some people thought that that tuberculosis, the fever and the whole interplay of things within the body, turned people with tuberculosis into these sort of sex-crazed lovers. And that is something that Susan Sontag talks about, that was a very common, you even find writing about it in, I have a volume of doctors' monographs on tuberculosis and research papers on tuberculosis from the 1930s, and you still have this idea. You have chapters about this idea of how people with tuberculosis have this sort of hypersexuality. And I haven't talked to any tuberculosis specialists recently, but I would feel about 99.9% sure that is no longer something that pretty much any of them believe in anymore. But at that time, that was sort of a cross you had to bear if you had tuberculosis, that people would think that you were kind of a sex maniac, and so that must have been annoying. And some people recommended, some doctors said, sex is good, it gets the blood flowing. Other doctors said, no, if you have this illness, you should absolutely not have sex. It should be completely prohibited. And there were even some laws in the U.S. on the books from here, from time to time, that made it illegal for someone with tuberculosis to marry, to knowingly, if you had the disease, you knew about it, you were not legally allowed to marry a healthy person. But I don't think that law was ever enforced. So, it seems like tuberculosis in these cases is sort of a stand-in for another disease, syphilis. So syphilis, it was definitely against the law, and I think they did try to enforce those laws, although how do you enforce something like that? Against people, a person with syphilis marrying a healthy person who doesn't have syphilis, and you can understand why. And if I understand it correctly, that was why you had to get a blood test in order to get married, at least in the U.S., which is as far as my knowledge goes. You had to have a blood test in order to get a marriage license, because there was a test called the Wassermann test, that would show then if you had syphilis. And if you had syphilis, then, you couldn't legally get married. And so, it seems like sometimes that those two diseases got mixed up with each other, and tuberculosis got the association with sex as much as syphilis did. And another sort of interesting thing has come to my attention lately with my research on Grand Duke Dmitri. I saw a video online. Actually, it turned out to be a really bad video, but about Dmitri's life, and it was, accurate to a certain extent on the main points, incontrovertible points of Dmitri's life, but it had a real political, anti-Semitic, unfortunately, axe to grind, not about Dmitri himself, but about all of Russia's problems being caused by Jews. So that was very, very unfortunate. And one thing that apparently is in Russia itself, among some historians, there's this idea that Dmitri's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, who more or less adopted Dmitri and his sister and raised them from 1902 until when he died in 1905. He was married, but he never had any children. And he was a gay man, and it's known that he was a gay man because because of documents that were left behind, not because he was out in that sense, but because of letters and diary entries and things like that were left behind. So, in that respect, he certainly could have had children, but he didn't. And that could be one reason why he and his wife didn't have children. But what the claim that's made in this video is that he didn't have children because he had tuberculosis, and he didn't want to have sex with his wife because he had this illness. Well, he was a tall, thin man, but he was a vigorous, hard-working man. He was the Governor General of Moscow, and there's nothing in anything that I've ever seen that suggested that he had tuberculosis. His brother, Dmitri's father, was also a tall, thin man who didn't have tuberculosis. And it occurred to me when I heard that no, you're talking about syphilis, not tuberculosis. And I've never heard that Grand Duke Sergei had syphilis either. So I'm not claiming that he did. But yeah, it does seem like these two diseases tended to get mixed up a little in people's minds and still get mixed up a little. And, syphilis was called, what was it called? The Great Imitator, because it could imitate just about any disease that you've ever seen. So for doctors, that made it difficult because it could focus on, the infection could focus on just about any part of the body, and it could affect the lungs. It could appear to be tuberculosis. And so, if you went to a doctor with any kind of fever or even, even aches and pains, back up until, through the 1930s, I think, the first thing that they would do is they would test you for tuberculosis and they would test you for syphilis. So they would do both of those. No matter what the disease looked like, they would do both of those. Yeah, so anyway, I've never read anybody like Susan Sontag writing about the syphilis illness as a metaphor. But okay, so I'm going too far afield with that. It would interest me to know Hans Castorp what Thomas Mann, through Hans Castorp, would have made of Dmitri if he'd written Dmitri in as a character based on the real person. Because here you have, again, one of these Russian types. Dmitri had lots of lovers. He was more or less known for that, had all these glamorous lovers. And so he was not a person who was sexually repressed. He was not bourgeois, because the values of the royalty and aristocracy are not bourgeois, and he was not sexually repressed. So, but he died. He was like Joachim. He was there at the sanatorium for a little over 2 years, and he died. And you could not trace his illness, certainly, to sexual repression. You could say there was some other unrealized passion, but it wasn't sexual. So, anyway, although it's interesting thinking about what Dmitri himself wrote. So he wrote diaries, but unlike most of the survivors from his own family, Romanov survivors and aristocratic survivors of the Russian Revolution, he didn't write memoirs. And I was thinking, aha, so here you have this dichotomy again. That I maybe wouldn't even have recognized if not for the influence of the Magic Mountain, which is that keeping diaries are very much an underworld activity, not in the sense of being negative, but in the sense that they belong to this secret private place. And indeed, it was where Dmitri allowed himself to express his emotions, whereas memoirs are out there in the bright light of day for everyone to scrutinize. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And so the last sentence of this chapter is, and I quote, "As if by tacit agreement, neither of them ever mentioned the lecture again." Neither of them being Hans Castorp and Joachim Ziemßen, the two cousins. They were embarrassed by it, and they never mentioned it again. But Hans Castorp, in addition to being embarrassed, was very much intrigued. And this is another step on this slippery slope that's going to bear him into the timelessness and license that he equates with the East. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope to see you next week. Bye.